Hello everyone, Roll D here and welcome to my Berwick Saga character tier list. I recently finished my first playthrough on stream and I loved the game so much I had to make at least one video going over my thoughts. I'm not normally one for tier lists in single player games, but for Berwick Saga I simply have to go over all the characters. Now disclaimer, these are all opinions based on my first playthrough plus theory crafting based on what I've read on things like growth rates, stat brackets, and abilities. It's very well possible that my opinions will change once I do a second playthrough and gain more knowledge of the game as a whole. Because the characters are so well balanced, I wanted to emphasize this by including A+ and B+ tiers instead of C and D. Also, I felt the game definitely incentivized selecting different units based on the map instead of favoring a small set of the cast. While I might point out many weaknesses for the lower tier characters, I think that they are still very viable if you have a good fundamental understanding of the game. Without further ado, let's start with Reese. As the main character of the game, he is forced on main missions, but forced to be on the bench for side missions. Thankfully though, he's actually good. He can give all allies within 3 hexes plus 10% accuracy, which means Reese simply existing is already a big boon for your army in a game where attacks regularly miss. He also has Adept, enabling him to potentially get a follow-up attack based on his speed. Another useful skill is Expert, enabling him to use equipment up to 7 ranks above his level. Relatively early in the game, he gets the Lord Graham, which is a sword exclusive to him that grants an additional attack, a good chance of a critical attack, and is very lightweight. Near the end of the game, he gets the Succeed, aka the Nothong, which is one of the game's strongest swords with a huge chunk of holy magic damage. Minor setback for Reese is that his stats are just good, not great, and he doesn't really excel at anything. The fact that he can't be deployed on side missions also hampers his growth. In regards to combat, there were times where I felt he just didn't do enough damage and couldn't hit reliably without Graham, a precious resource I wanted to save to ensure it didn't break. Without Graham, Reese's offensive capability is much lower. In spite of all this, everything else he has going for him makes up for it, and I feel he warrants being in the A+ tier. Next up is Ward. He starts off with high base stats, and in my experience he was still relevant all the way up until the very end, despite being unable to improve much throughout the game. I'm putting him in A+ tier. He's the only mounted unit with guard, meaning he can just swoop in and protect anyone in danger. His defense and the fact that he uses medium shields enables him to tank a few hits even with the defense penalty from using guard. The robust ability also works in tandem with this, preventing him from being injured or crippled. His starting level is very high, meaning he can pretty much use any equipment he wants, but on the other hand this means he has trouble gaining levels to up his stats, not that his growths are even good. This is what prevents him from being in S tier. Both his offense and defense stay pretty much the exact same throughout the entire game. He doesn't have any offensive skills, although he does still hit decently hard. Later in the game, there will eventually be other characters who hit harder and more accurately than him, as well as characters who can block more consistently. One last unfortunate setback for him is, somewhat like Reese, he cannot be deployed on side missions. However, he is not forced on most main missions. Adel! Unfortunately, Adel is probably not that good. He's gonna be down in B tier. I didn't use him much in my playthrough, but that's mostly because I didn't feel he would be worth it. Even though he has a special supporter skill with Leon, granting them both plus 20% accuracy when both of them are near each other, he just doesn't seem to have anything else going for him. His biggest issue is that his spear skill starts very low and also has a very low growth rate, meaning his accuracy will always be bad unless near Leon, severely limiting his positioning. What makes him special is that he has Vantage, which allows him to attack first even when an enemy initiates on him. Too bad he's not really fast enough to activate it consistently, and this probably only gets worse as you progress through the game as enemies get faster. He also has the throw ability, granting additional accuracy when using a throwing weapon, as well as allowing him to keep another weapon equipped after attacking, but this doesn't make or break him. Now, Leon is probably better compared to Adel. I'm not completely sure about him since I didn't use him much, but I'll put him in A based on what I think theoretically. The first advantage Leon has is Deathmatch, which lets him do extended battles with enemies. Obviously, you'll use this when the odds are on your side, so this does have a good level of utility. The Robust ability also synergizes well with this, allowing Leon to not have to worry about being injured or crippled after combat. Stats-wise and growths-wise, I think he's better than Adel, but he's no powerhouse. Most important is that his spear skill starts better and grows better, so he won't have as much of an issue hitting enemies. He also eventually gets the throw ability as well. Sherlock. Sherlock was amazing for me in the second half of the game, but I know that's because I invested quite a bit in him. I'm personally biased towards ranged units that are also mounted, and in addition, Sherlock has great skills exclusive to him. Namely, the ability to double shot and eventually triple shot after promotion, as well as 1-2 for attacking twice in one turn, so he can either attack two separate enemies or the same enemy twice. While the cooldowns on these skills are a bit long, being able to attack and potentially take out two enemies in one move is very strong, as well as getting to shoot twice and eventually 3 times in one attack. I think he's probably the best hit and run unit in the game, but that said, I don't think he gets strong enough to really do everything I talked about unless he's trained up. One extra thing he has going for him is that he also gets defensive utility with Overwatch, enabling him to potentially stop enemies that move within his range as long as he doesn't miss. His main weakness is that his starting stats and bow skill are rather low, so you'll need to spend quite a long time raising him, but thankfully his growths plus his stat brackets are pretty good. However, Esteban and especially Silvis both start off as better archers than Sherlock. I think it was worth raising him though because he also gets a horse with +1 extra movement on promotion, further improving his hit and run game. While he can get very strong, the time it takes for him to get there is a definite weakness, so he goes in A tier for me. Elbert was another unit who was amazing for me, except he was great from the very start. He has both Provoke and Arrow Bane, which means he can force an enemy unit to focus on him, and he also has a way higher chance to dodge arrows. On top of that, he has Shield Fair, so he blocks more often too. This makes certain maps far easier with him, especially when there are a lot of archers or extremely dangerous ballistas. His stats are also great. His weaknesses are that, in order to promote, he has to gain skill with his secondary weapon type of spears, which has a very low growth rate, and that means his very high sword growth isn't put to good use, which results in his combat being hampered. Since it takes forever for him to get promoted, plus the fact that he can't use medium shields until he's promoted, his defense isn't as good as someone like Ward or Arthur until later in the game. That being said, he's still good regardless of whether he promotes or not. I was kinda torn on whether he should be S or A+, but I feel the points I've brought up bring him down, so I'm putting him in A+. While I love mounted ranged units, Chris unfortunately kinda sucks with bows. Her main weapon type is crossbows, which means she has to attack adjacent enemies instead. She's similar to Elbert in that she has to gain skill with her secondary weapon type, bows in her case, in order to be promoted, so it takes forever. Not that she gains much from that promotion either. She also doesn't have good strength, so realistically she has to rely on crossbows, which don't use the strength stat for damage. While crossbows are stronger and more accurate overall compared to bows, they are extremely heavy, and Chris's lack of strength can't mitigate the weight, which means she can't dodge anything either. Eventually, I feel she falls off and becomes a bit of a liability in later maps. While she does have exclusive skills that enable her to swap horses with allies as well as heal horses, you are forced to do this in the middle of a map instead of being allowed to do it back at base. She does have the aim skill to help her accuracy, but it's way riskier to use that with a 1-range crossbow than with a 2-range bow, as you can only activate aim before moving. She's going in B+ tier for me. At the end of the day, she's still a mounted ranged unit with some hit and run utility. Now we come to Dean, the first unit available for hire in the game. He's my personal favorite unit and probably one of the best characters in this game. Right from the get-go, he's a powerhouse with very high base strength and speed, and high axe skill. He only gets better and better as you use him more. While he's low on defense, his extremely high strength and speed work in tandem with his skill set and also help his dodge rate since the weight of axes is mitigated by his strength, allowing him to maintain good dodge rates. On top of that, he has very high HP to offset his low defense. He has the Vengeful skill, making him one of the few units who can retaliate if he gets hit on enemy initiation. His high HP and low defense actually help make the skill better, where he can retaliate harder the more damage he takes. His other skills only accentuate his offense further. With his high speed, he activates Adept very often, allowing him to get an additional attack. He also has Desperation, which gives him plus 22% accuracy at the cost of lowering his defense to 0 and raising enemy accuracy to 100%. In most cases, this skill is used to finish off an enemy, meaning he won't have to take any damage anyway. Last but not least, he's cheaper than all of the other strong out of the box units available for hire. There's no doubt in my mind that he's in S tier. Izerna is the first healer you get, and for the majority of the game, she's the only healer you don't need to spend money to hire. I think she's the best healer for the majority of the game. After a few levels, she gains the Expert skill, allowing her to use magic up to 7 ranks higher than her current level. This makes it much easier to access high-level healing spells like Fortify, allowing her to heal multiple allies in one turn. Her main weakness is the fact that healers in general only have 3 movements, below the average of 4. She's also extremely squishy, and in Berwick Saga there are many maps where it can be difficult to keep units out of harm's way. Whenever deployment slots were limited, my first consideration was always whether to bench the healer or not. In those situations, I felt like fielding a healer was a liability most of the time since it was difficult to protect them, and they couldn't move far enough to get where they needed to go. While the Holy Spell allows her to vantage and stop most 0 and 1 range threats, I don't think this is something to rely on, as Holy has a very limited number of usages and is very expensive to purchase. On the other hand, I also felt the need to have a healer in as many maps as was possible, in order to not have to waste other units' turns using potions, not to mention the cost of buying a bunch of potions. With all of this considered, she's going in A tier for me. I have to admit, Volo is one of the few units I have not used even once, so I can't say anything about him definitively. A big setback against him is that he is very expensive to hire, but doesn't appear to be as strong as other expensive choices like Clifford and Sherpa, so I never felt compelled to use him. He does have deathmatch like Leon, and probably can perform better than him in that regard due to his higher offensive stats, but it could also go the other way since he's not tanky at all. He also has Adept, which should pair well with his high speed. At first glance, he's essentially a stronger version of Faye, so I think he deserves to be above her in A tier. But not any higher because again, why spend so much money to hire him when you can hire Clifford or Sherpa? Of course, I haven't used him at all, so this is purely theoretical. Axel is the only character in the game who can walk on water. He can also pick up items similar to thieves, and this combination means there are certain objectives which only he alone can do. Unfortunately, he isn't that good otherwise, but he still gets to go in B+ tier due to this fact. While he has high strength and decent speed, he starts with middling axe skill and very low growths in it. Higher accuracy axes are also rare compared to spears and especially swords. He does have the pulverize skill, which enables him to deal massive damage, but it can only be used prior to moving, and his low accuracy means it's always a gamble. He can also pillage items from enemies after killing them, but this barely ever activated for me. Lastly, he's not particularly tanky or dodgy either, and his defense growth is 0, but his HP is high enough to enable him to survive a couple hits. That said, he can hide in forests and buildings though. Next up is Silvis. She is both the best archer out of the box and the best overall archer period. All of the other archers require quite a bit of investment, but she alone is good from start to finish. Her relatively high strength enables her to hit harder than the other archers for most of the game. She also starts with good bow skill and decent growth for it as well. In regards to her abilities, similar to Sherlock, I highly value Overwatch for archers in this game, which enables defensive plays that otherwise can't be done. Another plus for her is that she has Expert, so she can access weapons stronger than her level. She also has Aim, which she can use better than Chris due to actually being proficient with bows, which can attack from 2 spaces away. Unlike Chris though, she can't hit and run. As a bonus, she can fire extra long-range shots from 3 spaces away at the cost of minus 15% accuracy, although like Aim, this can only be done prior to moving. And on top of all this, she has the skill Maim, which gives her a higher chance to cripple enemies so you can capture them for items and money, although in most cases you'll still need to set it up. Lastly, she can hide in forests and buildings, so unless she reveals her position, she'll be safe from harm. She goes in S tier for me. Outside of the map where you recruit her, I didn't use Ruby at all. It didn't seem worth it to hire her when Leon and Adel were similar enough, not to mention Arthur, who is just better overall. Theoretically, her Axe Bane skill should give her some exclusive utility to deal with enemies using axes. She starts with extremely low weapon skills but has very high growths in them. The problem is, she has low base strength and strength growths, so she doesn't quite hit hard enough. She can't quite tank that well either since she has low defense and can't use medium shields until after promotion. She does have high speed, but I'm not sure what she can really do with it other than dodging and eventually adept, which doesn't help if she can't hit back hard enough. What's nice is that she has Paragon, allowing her to gain levels more easily, but again, those levels probably won't do much for her. Without much an offensive or defensive utility, she's going in B tier unfortunately. Arthur first appears alongside Ruby, but man is he way better than her. His stats are just overall better, and he has abilities that are applicable much more often. By mid-game, he was one of my best units. While his strength starts off just okay, he has the highest strength growth in the game tied with Axel, and a small stat bracket to ensure he doesn't get RNG screwed. He has decent base defense, and it grows quite well too, further accentuated by his ability to use medium shields. He's not as fast as Ruby, but his speed is still above average. While his sword skill isn't amazing, it's not bad either. In terms of abilities, he can move 1 extra space at the cost of not being able to do anything afterwards, but this ability is great during downtime or if you need him to get somewhere as soon as possible. He also has Desperation, so like Dean, he can get extra accuracy to finish off enemies. Since Arthur can use shields, he can still block despite his defense being reduced to 0. Lastly, he has Flourish, a skill which gives him a higher chance to injure an enemy at the cost of halving his attack power. This is great for setting up cripples to capture enemies, allowing you to gain more items and money throughout the game. I wavered between S and A+ for him since out of all the other S tier characters he requires some investment, but ultimately he's good enough to be in S in my opinion. If you do decide to invest in him, he is sure to become one of the best offensive as well as defensive units. Czene is one of 2 thieves you get. The other thief, Thaddy, requires money to hire while Czene is free. On my first playthrough, I didn't really see any incentive to use thieves other than if there were chests or a lot of doors on the map, or if there was a quest requiring them. On one hand, there are things only thieves can do, but on the other hand, they don't seem to have much utility outside of this. I feel this warrants a B+ for Czene. She's a free unit, and on top of being able to do what thieves normally do, she has Watchful, giving her some utility in spotting hidden enemies, and upon promotion becomes a mounted unit, something I actually missed in my playthrough. She's also able to mug enemies when attacking, but the activation rate for this is incredibly low. Kramer at first seemed rather underwhelming to me, but as I proceeded through the game, his importance started becoming more apparent. He's the only unit in the game able to stand on cliffs and not have his dodge rate reduced to 0. He also has Aerobane, and with these 2 abilities together, certain maps become much easier with him around. I'm very glad that I invested in him because I honestly don't know how I would have done those maps, especially on a blind playthrough. He starts off alright, but he eventually becomes able to hold his own. A very fun and satisfying tactic is using him to run into enemy crossbow units that are using Overwatch, and then seeing him dodge with Aerobane, and then retaliate against the Overwatch with a counter slice. While some other units can technically do this, Kramer has the highest success rate due to having Aerobane plus good speed. I can see this making it sound like Kramer is very specialized, but he is still solid even against non-aero units. His other ability is being able to knock away shields, causing the enemy to unequip them. This especially helps against enemies using medium or large shields. Kramer doesn't quite make it to S though, since there's a clear difference in his combat ability relative to other S tier characters, and he's not the tankiest unit either. He's going in A+ tier for me. Faye first appears alongside Kramer and Czene, and she gave me the opposite impression compared to Kramer. With her incredible speed, she constantly activates Adept, and also is able to give herself an additional 25% chance for a critical attack when attacking prior to moving. She also comes with the Cutlass, an exclusive sword which gives her 1 additional attack. She has a defensive ability in Parry that assists her in avoiding physical attacks as long as she has a weapon equipped. On top of that, she has Iaido, which allows her to counterattack with plus 33% accuracy and plus 3% critical. This all makes it sound like she's amazing, but in practicality she started underperforming around a third into the game. She has low base strength, and although her strength growth is decent, her strength stat bracket is large, meaning she can get screwed over by RNG. Every time I used her, she barely did any damage to anything. Upon promotion, she gains the Astra skill, which allows her to attack 5 times in a row, however its cooldown is 7 turns. Her HP and defense are as low as magic type characters, which means in most cases she dies in 2 hits, sometimes even 1. While she is good at dodging relative to other characters, this doesn't mean she'll dodge forever. A side effect of parry is that it actually uses up weapon durability, causing your weapons to break sooner. Other than the first few maps I deployed her, she didn't do much for me until the very end of the game, at which point she gets the Vritra, a sword exclusive to her. It does help with killing chaos, but outside of that, she didn't do much work. She's going in B+ tier. While I've only played the game once, I still think Derrick is the single worst unit in the game and not really worth using at all. Why would you ever spend money to hire him? He's an armored unit, which means he'll have more trouble getting around compared to any other unit in the game. While his defense starts very high, he has 0% growth in it, and eventually there will be other units who will have about as much defense, but with many other perks like movement and abilities. Derrick has Mercy, Throw, and Axe defense. Throw is good for additional accuracy for one-range axes and being able to keep another weapon equipped, but it's obviously not a skill that makes or breaks anything. Axe defense enables Derrick to use his axe as a shield, but you have to stay still to activate it first, and you can't counterattack with it active. Mercy is nice for setting up captures, but it's not like Derrick's the only guy who can do that, provided he hits. Axes with high accuracy are quite rare, and Derrick's axe skill growth is also very low. His large shield skill growth isn't that great either, so he won't even block that much, especially compared to units with shield fare like Elbert and Clifford. Based on my experience, there are very few situations in Berwick Saga where your goal is just to tank hits forever, especially since the turn system in this game incentivizes offense over defense. The more enemies there are, the more they get to act consecutively. I would rather have someone who has slightly lower defense but more utility elsewhere, as well as good offensive power. Also, there's no guarantee Derrick will be the target of enemy attacks anyway, since he doesn't have Provoke nor Guard, unless you're in a choke point, which is rare in this game. I just don't see how he could add anything to your army, and that's why I'm putting him in his own tier at the very bottom. Now here's a great unit out of the box for hire. Clifford is in my opinion the overall strongest unit out of the box. While other units will eventually become stronger than him in a specific area, or just do something he can't do like attack from range or use magic, he will always be good with absolutely zero investment. He has the second highest base defense in the game, plus the Provoke and Shield Fear abilities, making him a great tank who can pull enemies to him. He has the highest base strength in the game tied with Sherpa, plus very high base spear skill and good sword skill, so he's not going to miss often. He's also the only unit who starts off being able to use lances, which prevent counterattacks from enemies and also have absurd damage bonuses based on how many spaces you move. While the weakness of lances is that Clifford himself can't counterattack, that's not a big deal as long as Clifford isn't just in the middle of a huge enemy crowd. The fact that enemy lance users were always the main concern in my playthrough whenever they appeared is a testament to how strong lances are. His only weakness is that he's obviously extremely expensive as a unit available for hire, which definitely disincentivized me from trying to rely on him too often, so I didn't actually get to use him that much. I debated dropping him to A+ tier just for this reason, but I decided his performance is still good enough to warrant being an S. I only used Faramir once, and that was because he was part of Faye's story map. Theoretically, he should be good since he's the only infantry unit with 5 movement, plus good offensive stats as well as being the only unit in the game who is both good at melee and ranged attacks with high sword and high bow skill. While there are other units who can use both melee weapons and ranged weapons like Chris and Esteban, the amount of time required to get high skill in both weapon types isn't worth it for them. He also has his own unique sword, the Over Cutlass, which is a better version of Faye's Cutlass. The issue is that he has no offensive skills whatsoever, somewhat hampering his offensive-based stat spread. He does have defensive skills like Parry and Fortune. Parry helps him with avoiding attacks at the cost of weapon durability. Fortune allows him to prevent enemy critical attacks, but I don't think that makes a big difference since he should be trying to avoid getting hit anyway considering his low defense and middling HP. Another weakness is that he can only be hired if you've already hired Faye. Since Faye is not that great in my opinion, it can feel like a waste of money to hire someone just so you can then go hire someone else. Still, I think Faramir has enough going for him to be an A tier. Esteban is another infantry archer along the lines of Silvis, however, at first glance he was incredibly underwhelming. Excluding his bow skill, his starting stats aren't great, but you have to pay for him while Sherlock is free. I wasn't sure why I would ever need to hire him considering Silvis is available first and starts off way stronger. However, once you get a bit more acquainted with the game, his utility becomes more apparent. Firstly, due to his night vision ability, in Fog of War maps he can enable you to see further away. He also negates the dodge bonus from enemies in forests with his Huntsman skill. He gains 1.5 times the dodge bonus from terrain thanks to camouflage, and is also able to hide in forests and buildings similar to thieves. He eventually gets aim to make him even more accurate, as well as being one of 2 units who get the pursuit skill, allowing him to get an additional attack as long as his attack speed is 5 higher than the enemy. With good stat growths and amazing bow skill growth, Esteban can actually become very strong with investment, especially when he gets the Pascanian bow as part of his storyline. The downside to the Pascanian is that there is a % chance per bow skill point below 50 for it to backfire and harm the user. That said, Esteban's bow skill growth is high enough that he should be able to reach 50 in most playthroughs. In the same vein as Sherlock, he can become incredibly strong, but the amount of investment required drops him to A tier. Aegina or Aegina, or sometimes called Angina, is the first mage you get. She can use wind and fire magic, but her wind skill is higher as well as having a higher growth rate. That said, her wind skill growth isn't really that high, which is actually an issue when attempting to promote her. I invested quite heavily in her, but she never got enough wind skill to ever promote. She can still do her job without being promoted though, and her role is mainly to cut through high defense units like armor knights, as well as dragons based on their elements. As much as I like magic units in general, in Berwick Saga I feel mages just aren't that great overall. Aegina is obviously squishy, and not that fast either, so her dodge rate isn't the greatest. Her biggest weakness is that most magic is 1 range, and only her exclusive Palace Rihanna spell is 2 range. However, as it is exclusive and irreplaceable along with the fact that magic cannot be repaired, you'll always have to consider conserving it instead. This means she'll risk being in danger a lot of the time. While she does have Miracle, in this game it only gives an additional 10% dodge against attacks that can potentially kill her, which is nowhere near consistent enough to rely on. Her only other skill is Focus Chant, which grants her additional accuracy and adds bonus damage based on her magic stat, but has a rather long cooldown. There really isn't much else to say. Unless there was clearly an enemy I would have trouble taking down without a mage, I just wouldn't field any. She's still good enough to be in B+ tier in my opinion. Sherpa is another incredibly strong unit out of the box, and probably the second strongest available for hire. Although he isn't as all-encompassing as Clifford, his exclusive sword Brimranger, which grants 2 additional attacks, as well as his very high strength and sword skill gives him very high offensive power unmatched by anyone else until later in the game. Not that he needs the Brimranger either, he's still very good with any sword. He's also much easier to recruit permanently compared to Clifford. His best skill is Windsweep, an ability that can be used prior to moving, allowing him to attack while preventing counterattacks. Other than that, his great offensive stat spread is somewhat hampered by having mostly defensive-based abilities. Like Ward, he can also guard other units, but his defense isn't great enough for him to be able to do it consistently, not to mention the fact that he can't use shields. In spite of his middling defense, he is one of the few units who can counterattack even when hit, and he has robust so he'll never be injured or crippled. As great as he is, I feel he doesn't quite make it to S tier, so he's going in A+ tier. Saphir is the second healer available in the game, however she is not free like Izerna. She doesn't have expert, so her immediate usefulness as a healer is not as good as Izerna either. The obvious first impression I had was, why pay for her? I didn't see any reason to invest in a level 1 healer when I had already committed to Izerna at that point. I also didn't think it would be worth trying to field 2 healers at once since I already had enough trouble trying to protect one. She does have the Imbue skill, which allows her to heal a small amount of HP as a command, but if she ever gets hit, she's probably near death anyway, so just using a potion would be better. It wasn't until late in the game when she gets automatically promoted where her true worth is revealed. She can prevent dark magic from being used for 3 turns, and she can also give all allies within 3 spaces plus 5 magic resistance. Because I didn't use her at all in my first playthrough, I missed her recruitment. While she would have helped a lot for the final chapter, ultimately I think her utility is very limited since there aren't many magic enemies in the first place. Izerna is still the better healer for the vast majority of the game, so Saphir gets stuck in B tier for me. Owen is yet another healer available for hire, and he actually starts off better than both Izerna and Saphir. He starts at a much higher level, has better stats, and can even use fire, wind, and thunder magic despite his skill for all three being very low. He even has a bunch of rare healing spells in his starting inventory. Similar to Izerna, he has Expert plus a unique ability that allows him to instantaneously escape the map. This obviously sounds like he should be an even higher tier than Izerna, but there's a reason why he can escape the map and why ultimately I think he's only in B+ tier. If you don't make him leave the map on turn 20, he will turn into an enemy dark magic unit. I suppose you could make the argument that he would still be better than Izerna if you're sure that you won't need him past turn 20, but personally I think the pressure that results from this is still too much of a weakness. Daoud is the only character in the game without stat brackets, meaning he can either become incredibly strong with good RNG, or get completely screwed over with bad RNG. His base stats aren't bad, but as growth rates are relatively low overall in Berwick Saga, the odds are still against you. His abilities are also not that great. While he can charge up to increase his attack power and hit rate, he must stand still to do this. He also has axe defense, but using it means he's sacrificing a counterattack for a chance to block attacks with his axe. I don't think this is even necessary considering Daoud can use shields. Robust is nice for preventing injuries and cripples as always. I do think Daoud is a better user of Pulverize over Axel since his axe skill growth is higher and he can defend himself with a shield, making it easier for him to position himself. If Daoud were a mounted unit, I would consider using him since there are no playable mounted axe units, but for some reason you can't give him a mount, and yet he has the same movement type as a cavalry unit, meaning he will have additional trouble traversing terrain like forests, shoals, and cliffs. With all of this considered, I think he belongs down in B tier. Larentia is the game's one and only playable flying unit. Due to how this game works, Larentia cannot be targeted by zero range weapons and can only be hit by them on counterattacks. While enemies can move through her due to how flying works, her job isn't to block anyway. As she can simply move freely in any direction, in most cases you'll be using her to quickly get to a faraway objective, or to attack from an otherwise unreachable tile. Her starting stats aren't amazing, but they're still good enough for her to deal good damage and tank some hits. Her spear skill is also quite good, so she won't miss too often. She also has great abilities, being able to prevent counterattacks with Wind Sweep, Adept to potentially attack twice, Throw to get additional accuracy with one-range weapons, Watchful to spot hidden enemies, and lastly Mercy to help set up cripples. With all of this utility, she's gotta go in S tier. Thaddy is the second thief in the game, but isn't free like Czene. He does have slightly better stats compared to Czene, but it's not like he's going to be a combat unit anyway. He doesn't have Watchful like Czene, but instead has Provoke. I don't know why you would want a thief to pull enemies though, even if his dodge rates are pretty good. Another difference he has is that instead of Mug, he can straight up steal from enemies, but this is limited to 3 times per map and cannot be used after moving. While this does have its uses, I'm not sure it warrants hiring and fielding him just for that reason. And if you're gonna use a thief to open doors and chests, Czene can just do it for free. Thaddy goes in B tier for me. Marcel is another armored unit, and while he's available later than Derrick, he's a free unit. Excluding defense, he has better base stats and skill over Derrick, as well as higher growth rates across the board. Once he's high enough level, he gets upgraded to 4 movement. Lastly, as a tank, he actually has guard, allowing him to cover an ally. Unfortunately, that's all he has going for him. He's still an armor unit, meaning he'll always be hampered by terrain in a game where movement is key in many maps. His combat isn't that great, although he does get the exclusive Blade Zweihander later in the game, granting him 1 additional attack, although the Zweihander is actually usable by any Blade users level 20 or above. At the end of the day, the same general principle with Derrick applies to Marcel. I'd rather have someone who has slightly less defense but more utility elsewhere. Marcel goes down in B tier for me. Enid starts off as a sword unit with rather low base stats and skill by the time you get her, and not much going for her in terms of abilities as well. She does have Paragon, which allows her to gain levels more easily. She also has Charm, which is a weaker version of Reese's commander ability but with longer range. I'd personally rather have plus 10% accuracy over 3 spaces than plus 3% accuracy over 5 spaces. In my playthrough, I actually just took her sword and gave it to Larentia and then benched her forever. Now, if you do choose to invest in her, what you have to do is level her magic stat to 5 and then she will change class. Afterwards, she will be able to use fire and thunder magic, with her skill in fire having a much higher growth rate. I would say she's much better used as a mage since her strength is simply too low, plus she doesn't have any skills to aid her physical offense. She does get focus chant like Aegina, allowing her to cast a spell with additional accuracy and bonus damage. What's nice about fire magic is that the base accuracy of many fire spells is better than the other magic types, and Enid has very high skill growth compared to both Aegina and the last mage, Perceval. In spite of her strengths, she is one of the characters that requires the absolute most investment in the entire game, and magic overall still isn't that great. She's unfortunately going in B tier. Perceval is technically the third mage you get, although it is highly unlikely that Enid will be promoted in a single map since Perceval becomes available just after you recruit Enid. Perceval's main magic type is Thunder, and in my opinion, Thunder is the best type since there are more 2-range spells available compared to Wind and Fire. This means Perceval can consistently attack from a safer range unlike Aegina and Enid, along with his higher base magic and skill growth, as well as the fact that he has Adept in Arrowbane. I feel he's the best mage in the game. On top of this, he has Mercy to help set up cripples. Perceval will go in A tier. Burroughs is the one and only ballistician available. That's cool and all, but in many cases, a unit that can only attack if they sit still is not very useful in the majority of maps in Berwick Saga. This probably means he'll spend most of his time moving around instead of actually attacking. Even worse, ballistas have to spend a turn to change their direction of fire. And God forbid an enemy actually gets close to him, as ballistas can only attack starting from 3 spaces away. In my opinion, fielding him is more just for having fun shooting people from far away, as opposed to him actually being a truly great tactical choice. That said, he has his uses in some very specific situations, so he still gets to go in B tier. Alvina is a paladin who joins rather late into the game. Unfortunately, by that point she's not that impressive, and her base stats are actually lower than Ward excluding her speed. She does have decent growths overall though. She has an exclusive spear that grants 1 additional attack, but her accuracy with it isn't the greatest. However, she does have pretty good skills in Adept, Shield Fair, Throw, and Mercy. If she wasn't such a late arrival, I would consider putting her in A+, but she'll have to go in A tier. Paramythis is the second to last unit to become playable despite making appearances relatively early in the game. She is overall the best healer in the game, and if she were playable earlier, I would consider putting her in S tier, but I'll have to knock her down to A+. Not only does she have a horse, but for a healer she has more base defense than like half the cast, so you won't have to worry at all about her. While she has decent strength and sword skill, her combat isn't really that impressive by the time you get her, but that's not her main purpose anyway. Being a healer on a horse means she can reach allies much easier. While she doesn't have Expert, she starts at a very high level, so it's not a big deal in her case. She also has Imbue similar to Saphir, but in Paramythis' case, it works better because of her higher base magic as well as her defense. The Versatile ability allows her to use any healing spell without needing to actually equip it. She also has Camouflage, giving her additional dodge rates from terrain. And while she isn't really a combat unit, she has both Flourish and Pursuit. Unfortunately, since I missed recruiting Saphir, I also missed recruiting Paramythis as well. Lynette is the final character you get and only available for the final map. I can't imagine doing the final map without her, not that you have a choice since she's forced. She grants +5 defense to all allies within 3 spaces and also has the most powerful lightning magic in the game. You can also just steal Perceval's thunder magic and give it to her, she'll probably use it better. On top of that, she has good bow skill plus an exclusive 3-range bow, allowing her to help take out some of the pesky dark mages and archers in the final map. There are several heavily armored Gigas Knights on the map as well, and Lynette can really help take them out, plus she can actually deal decent damage to the final boss. She has Magic Bane, which allows her to have a much higher rate of dodging magic, again helping her with the final boss. When Reese attacks while adjacent to Lynette, he gets an automatic critical, which also helps with many of the high defense enemies. Her only weakness is the fact that she is very frail, with low HP and low defense as well as middling speed. She's another character who I would consider putting in S tier, but it doesn't feel right to do so for someone who's only available for 1 map, so I'm going to put her in A+. And that's everyone. Again, with a good understanding of the game, anyone can be a viable pick. You can probably make Derrick work out somehow. I'm sure my opinions will change after a second playthrough, which I plan to do sometime later this year. I may do a ranked run, but the dynamic of a ranked run is also very different from a regular playthrough, so I'm not sure yet. Anyway, that's all for now, and I'll see you in the next one.